Recently, the 50th G7 summit concluded in Italy. The major highlight was the new Ukraine funding plan by the G7 countries, which is making headlines. A significant decision was made regarding Russia's frozen assets, leading to strong reactions from Russia. Russia has even threatened to retaliate against Western countries. What is this funding plan? What is the issue with the frozen assets? Why is Russia so angry? And why is this plan being called vague and risky? Let's break it down in simple terms. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. If you remember, after this, many Western countries froze the Russian central bank assets located in their territories. Russia's overseas assets in countries like the US, UK, France, and Germany were frozen. Freezing the assets means that Russia cannot access them. This means that whatever holdings the Russian central bank has in these territories, gold, cash, securities, etc., have been blocked. Their worth is estimated to be around $300 billion. So, despite owning these frozen assets, Russia cannot use them for now. The legal ownership still remains with Russia. However, Russia cannot use these assets as long as they remain frozen. But since these assets belong to Russia, they can't be just taken away and handed over to Ukraine, as this would be a violation of international law. So Western countries devised a plan to use the interest generated from these assets to support Ukraine. Now, assume that you live in India and have some money in a US bank. Naturally, whatever interest is generated on that money will also be yours. The money kept there is yours, so any earnings from interest on it will also be yours, isn't it? Just because the money is stored in the US, that doesn't mean the US will take the interest on your money. Does it make sense? But not to the G7 countries, who have decided together that they will support Ukraine with the interest generated from the frozen Russian assets. How? A $50 billion loan will be taken from the international market, and this money will be handed over to Ukraine. Ukraine will receive this money by the end of this year. With these $50 billion, Ukraine will buy weapons and rebuild war-torn areas. Will Ukraine have to repay this loan? Nope. This $50 billion loan will be repaid from the interest earnings on frozen Russian assets. Amidst slowing aid, Ukraine's President Zelensky described getting such a huge amount as a vital step in defeating Russia. The interest from Russia's immobilized assets is being used against Russia itself. This is the clever strategy of Western countries to reduce their domestic pressure, as they can now tell their public that instead of giving their money to Ukraine as aid, they are giving Russia's money to Ukraine. This is the game plan of the West. Obviously, Russia has called it theft, and Putin has threatened to retaliate. According to Russia, Western nations are violating the principles of global economic system. Those who talk about a rules-based order are themselves breaking the rules as per their convenience. So, what if Russia also starts doing this? It can also compensate for its revenue loss and damages from the Western assets frozen in Russia. This means Russia and Western countries could start usurping each other's interests from frozen assets in their territories. Before the war, many Western companies were operating in Russia, and they had assets there. In retaliation to the funding plan of the G7 countries, Russia could target the assets of these Western companies. This could snowball into both sides taking bolder steps in the future. Right now, the assets are only being frozen. But what if the assets get completely seized later when tensions escalate? The possibility is low, but not zero. This has happened before. The US seized Cuban funds in 1996 and Iraqi funds in 2003. Morality is long gone. Now the risk is whether international law will be followed or not. If Russia and the West start targeting each other's assets this way, what will happen to the trust of depositors? This would not be good at all for the global financial system. Overall, this funding plan is quite vague and very risky. Remember that this amount of $50 billion would be a loan taken from the international market. The loan will have to be repaid. As of now, the G7 countries think that since Russian assets are frozen, the interest coming from these is profit, so they will repay the loan from that. Are you seeing the assumption made by the G7 here? That the amount of money needed for the loan installments will come from the interest on frozen Russian assets. But what if that much amount is not generated from Russian assets? In this case, the G7 nations will have to find other ways to repay the loan. Further, the decision to freeze Russia's assets has to be renewed every 6 months, requiring the consent of all the member states of the European Union. Even if one member opposes this decision, Russia's assets cannot be frozen. EU member countries such as Slovakia, Bulgaria, and especially Hungary are known for their soft stance towards Russia. So, if any one of them vetoes, Russia's assets cannot be blocked. Also, what if a peace deal is reached or the sanctions are lifted and Russia's frozen assets get unfrozen? Then Russia will have control over those assets as well as the interest accruing from them. How will this $50 billion loan be repaid then? Additionally, market fluctuations could make loan repayment difficult, but the G7 nations have conveniently not taken this into account. The chief of the European Commission has made a vague statement that all G7 countries will contribute to the loan, but no one knows the details and there is no clarity. Not to forget, there are US elections in November. What will be the result, which party will come to power, and what their viewpoint will be regarding support for Ukraine, no one knows this either. Clearly, many issues could arise in the near future, leading to differences among Western countries. G7 countries have been providing financial and military aid to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. For now, it seems that training the Ukrainian military, sharing intelligence, and providing aid and equipment will continue. So, the support of the US and Europe for Ukraine is increasing. However, provoking Russia in this way in the name of support could prove to be a turning point in the war.